I advertised the talk as being about Locke, Berkeley and Hume, but when I came to prepare it, I couldn't get them all in. So in fact, it's going to be about David Hume, although I'd love to talk about Locke and Berkeley too. But I think I've selected David Hume because he's one of the very few great classical philosophers in the Western tradition who has been anti-religious and who has had arguments against the rationality of belief in God. So he's a particularly interesting case to take, and many anti-religious people in Britain still use Hume's arguments, so it's quite important to look at them. What I want to do, just to sketch it out in general, is to argue against the whole basis of Hume's philosophy and show that his philosophical outlook results in a contempt, well, contempt's too strong a word perhaps, but a failure to account for the success of modern science, and so it may be that it also fails to account for rational religion. So let's begin by looking at what he says about reason. There's a legend or a myth going around that the European Enlightenment was a very rational affair and that it privileged reason over everything else. Well, one thing to point out straight away is that there wasn't really a European Enlightenment at all. There was a German Enlightenment, a French Enlightenment, an American Enlightenment, and a Scottish Enlightenment, and they're all very different. The Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century certainly did exist, and David Hume is certainly the best-known philosopher of that time. He's best known today, though it should be pointed out that in his own day, Thomas Reid was a much more famous philosopher, and Thomas Reid was much more representative of the Scottish Enlightenment. Reid was a philosopher of common sense, and I shall say a little about him in a moment. But David Hume gives the lie to any idea that the Enlightenment privileged reason, because David Hume did the opposite. He said, in a rather famous phrase, reason is the slave of the passions. So he wasn't saying that reason is something that can tell you the nature of the universe or even how to live. It's your passions which lead to the beliefs that you have. Reason has a very subordinate function indeed, and even then you probably shouldn't trust it. I quote from the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. He says, "Human understanding is by no means fitted for such remote and abstruse subjects as considering the nature of reality." So he was an anti-rationalist. He opposed philosophers like Leibniz or Spinoza or Descartes, who held that reason could tell you something about the nature of reality, and Hume felt that it couldn't. Human understanding just wasn't fitted for that. So what does tell you about the nature of reality? Well, custom and habit. Custom is the great guide of human life, he said. And philosophy itself, philosophy would render us entirely skeptical were not nature too strong for it. Perhaps you remember David Hume's advice that when you'd done a lot of philosophy and you couldn't work out the answers to all your philosophical problems, you should just go off and have a game of what we would now call snooker, and then you'd feel much better. So playing snooker would restore you to a sense of reality. Doing philosophy wouldn't. So he's one of those philosophers who spend their lives writing books saying that philosophy is a waste of time, except, of course, that it clears away the problems that past philosophers have propounded. First of all, they raised a dust, and then they complained that they could not see. So common sense and habit seem to be the things that he's really basing his philosophy on, or so it would seem. Though it's rather odd if he does that, and if he does that, he's agreeing, of course, with Thomas Reid and all the other major philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment. If he makes common sense the test, then belief in God almost certainly is allowable. It seems to be a very natural, commonsensical belief that there is a God. Most people naturally think that there's some sort of designer of the universe, and whatever sophisticated arguments come along to disprove that, people will go on feeling there must be something behind it all, really, something intelligent and conscious, perhaps. It's a very natural belief. So even if it's not natural in our society, it certainly was in the 18th century in Scotland, and perhaps if habit and custom is what governs your belief, it will vary from one place to another anyway. And it would be right to say, well, whatever is the habit of my society is the sensible thing to believe. It's a very conventionalist view of what you ought to believe. Certainly Thomas Reid thought that belief in God was part of the common sense view. But was David Hume really a common sense philosopher? He did say, yes, custom and habit give you the beliefs that you have, but he nevertheless had a philosophy, and it was a philosophy to which people like Thomas Reid took exception. Reid called Hume's philosophy the philosophy of ideas and impressions, and so it was. In contemporary philosophy, we'd probably call it phenomenalism, which is a nice long word. Phenomenalism is the view very like that held by A.J. Ayer in the 20th century and by the logical positivists of the Vienna Circle, although in Hume's version it wasn't so interested in science. But phenomenalism is the view that the only things that are real are experiences, things like what we see around us now. If you look at the room around you, you see lots of colored shapes. That is the basis of your knowledge, and your knowledge doesn't extend further than that. Colored shapes, but of course also sounds and touches, so all sense experiences. All knowledge, in other words, derives from sense experience, and that is what I have called the empiricist term. As opposed to people who thought, well, knowledge at least partly derives from the use of reason and understanding, Hume's view was very clear. All knowledge derives simply from sense experience. And in this, of course, he's following John Locke. John Locke, who said, and I quote from Locke's essay concerning human understanding, Locke said, knowledge seems to me to be nothing but, whenever somebody says that, you know it's going to be wrong, but there it is, knowledge seems to be nothing but the perception of the connection and agreement or disagreement and repugnancy of some of our ideas, that is, our sense perceptions. In this alone it consists. Now, I just want you to consider what a very rigorous and parsimonious view of human knowledge that is. Knowledge consists only of sense perceptions and what you can immediately derive from them. It doesn't consist in theories at all. Hume makes the point very strongly. He says, our conclusions are not founded on reasoning or any process of the understanding. It's just a matter of attending to your sense perceptions and mixing them around in various ways. You can detect resemblances between various perceptions. You can see that some of them are closer to each other than others are, and you have habitual connections that you make between them, but that's all there is. The whole of knowledge consists in just a flow of transient sense perceptions. Now, that view is why I say that it can't account for the success of science at all, because scientists do not consider the world to consist in a flow of transient sense perceptions. In fact, some of the scientists I know go to the opposite extreme and say there aren't any sense perceptions at all, that consciousness is just an illusion. Well, that is just as extreme as Hume's view, but it's important to notice they're both extreme views. To say you have no consciousness, you have no sense experience, it's just your brain going around various mechanical movements which makes you fall under the illusion that there is consciousness. That's Daniel Dennett's view, basically. That's one extreme, and the other extreme is there's nothing but sense experiences, nothing else at all, no reason, no understanding, habit and custom, yes, but just sense experience. Now, that view does not seem to be commonsensical. Common sense doesn't believe that at all. So there's a huge tension in David Hume's thought between, on the one hand, his skeptical view of reason and his phenomenalism, that is, his view that there's nothing but sense experiences, on the other hand, his view that reason, because it can't tell you anything, tells you that, in fact, knowledge consists of nothing but sense experiences. Now, Hume drew the conclusion, correctly, I think, that if knowledge consists of nothing but sense experiences, then there are a number of things that you cannot show to be true. One is that there's anybody there, anywhere. Do other people exist? I mean, yes, I have sense experiences of you, but are you behind them? I wouldn't think so. If my knowledge consists of nothing but my sense experiences of you, then I have no knowledge whatsoever of your thoughts and feelings and consciousness, indeed of your mind. In fact, you probably haven't got minds. In fact, you haven't got minds. But I'm not being arrogant, because I haven't got a mind either. And what Hume said was that there is no such thing as a mind. There is no self which knows, which thinks. There is no thinking thing. There is only the flow of impressions. Hume used the word impression for the direct sense experience that we have, whereas he used the word idea to mean an image or a memory of an impression. So all knowledge for Hume was founded on what he called impressions. So no other minds, not even any external world, that is, no objects existing unobserved, because if knowledge consists in nothing but sense experiences, then you could never know that there are any objects which you're not looking at. And that's where Bishop Berkeley, of course, comes in. At least I'm mentioning his name, even if I haven't got time to say much about him tonight. And Bishop Berkeley, as you probably know, held that if something is not being observed, then it doesn't exist. Of course, he did think everything was being observed by God, which is a sort of saving clause. But if you omit God from the picture, then I have to tell you that Bishop Berkeley's tomb does not exist in Christ Church Cathedral in Oxford at this moment. But if you went and looked at it, it would. And most of us feel, well, Berkeley's philosophy is just, I mean, it might be very attractive in some ways, but it's just too extreme to be true. Most of us are realists in some sense. We think that there are things that are existing when we are not looking at them. More than that, we think there are probably laws of nature which have some sort of necessity about them. Things necessarily obey laws of nature. Things will necessarily fall to the ground if I drop them. Well, again, Hume was bound to say, well, no, if your knowledge consists of nothing but sense impressions, you're not entitled to say that. So almost everything drops out of Hume's philosophy. No causality, no other minds, no external world, no knowledge that the future is going to be like the past. You can't know that because you haven't seen it yet. It's not a sense impression. No self which knows. What is there? Well, only habit and custom. So the two parts of Hume's philosophy are, as far as reason goes, it just tells you you can't really know anything except your sense experiences. But then you're saved from complete anarchy by common sense, which says, well, of course you can't justify anything you think, but just think it anyway because custom leads you to do it. So he becomes a complete conventionalist. Right, those are the two halves of Hume's philosophy. How do they hold together? Well, I don't think they do, as a matter of fact, which is one of my complaints about Hume's philosophy. I think you do need a philosophical system which more or less holds things in one coherent bunch. John Locke didn't manage it either, of course, because though my quotation that all knowledge consists in nothing but impressions, or as Locke said, ideas, Locke actually did believe in God. He even believed that you could prove that there was a God as a very probable hypothesis. Locke thought a certain hypothesis. And Locke believed in primary qualities, that is to say, the qualities which objects have when you're not looking at them. You remember the distinction Locke made between primary and secondary qualities was that a secondary quality is a thing like a color, a colored shape, a touch, a smell, things that you immediately experience. But a primary quality is something that objects have even when you're not looking at them. And most scientists would actually agree with this. A primary quality is something like mass, extension, and position. And certainly a Newtonian scientist would have said, well, what exists when you're not looking at it, at things, are small particles, atoms, and they have mass, and they have position, and they have velocity. Physicists might doubt that these days. They don't doubt that atoms have those things, but smaller particles don't have all those properties. So scientists don't actually quite agree with Locke, but on the whole they agree that there must be some things with some properties out there. Hume seems to be committed to saying there aren't, or if you say there are, that's just a matter of convention. That conventionalist view could be called, I think, pragmatism. And I think Humean empiricism leads to pragmatism very rapidly. Pragmatism, a view which became very widespread in American philosophy for some strange reason, is that it's true if it works. All right? You might say the British philosophy is it's true if it doesn't work, but the American philosophy is it's true if it does work. And William James was a pragmatist. There's some very famous American pragmatists. So the test of truth for a pragmatist, or the test of even knowledge at all, is whether something works. But again, of course, if you are a pragmatist, God probably comes rather well out of this. Well, that might be debatable, but what you'd be debating about would be whether believing in God is useful or not. Does it work? And if you say, well, what could believing in God work? I mean, what could it do? Well, it might make you happy. I mean, if you thought there was a being which loved everybody, and especially you, that might make you very happy. If it made you depressed, perhaps you should say it's false. But that would be the test, you see. So if your belief in God made you more depressed, you'd say that's a false belief. And that's what you mean by saying it's a false belief. Whereas if your belief in God made you happy, you'd say, as a pragmatist, that's a true belief. So people might still differ about God, but probably most people would say, on the whole, God seems to make people happy. The older people get, the happier God seems to make them, as long as they believe they're going to heaven, of course. So having a nice belief about a loving God is quite good. As a matter of fact, you probably know that all the social psychology studies show that believing in God is good for your mental health. People tend to feel more content with their self-image if they think there's a God. And people are also more altruistic. I mean, the statistics are clear for anybody to read. So the effects seem to be, despite what Richard Dawkins tends to say, who hasn't read any of these statistics, the statistics tend to say, well, pragmatically, religion is on the whole good for you. Of course, there's some very bad bits of religion, obviously, and religion is very bad for some people, but on the whole, overall, it's got a good effect. So if you're a pragmatist, you probably would believe in God. So again, you've got the mysterious question, if belief in God is both a matter of common sense and pragmatically positive, why doesn't Hume believe in God? It can't be because it's irrational, because he doesn't think reason can tell you anything about the world at all. So it can't be based on that. So I think Hume was a bit stuck. In other words, I do want to say, his arguments against religion and against God are not based on anything at all. They're based on pure prejudice, and probably something to do with the Church of Scotland. Well, one of the things that Hume's philosophy can't cope with, of course, is science. So let me just point out some of the ways in which it can't cope at all with science. And I'm going to talk in particular about the great text of Hume. It has become something which is on the reading list of every first-year philosophy course in Britain. It is the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And some people, in fact, think the arguments in it are very strong. I intend to show now that they're extremely weak. Now, I shall begin with his first argument. I'm going to mention, I think, 5 major arguments, which are the 5 main arguments of the Dialogues, and show how weak they are. See, I'm nothing if not arrogant. I will try and have 1 or 2 questions at the end for Humeans who are still devoted to the cause. Well, the first point he makes is this. How could reason, this is his point again about reason not being fit to tell you everything, the paltry effects of human brains, what could they possibly tell you about the universe? And he says, with what assurance can we decide concerning the origin of worlds? The point being, you see, that if you can't see something, if you can't have a sense experience of it, you have no knowledge of it. Now, obviously, nobody has sense experience of the origin of this universe. So for Hume, you can't talk about it. There is no possible knowledge of it. Well, one of the most flourishing subjects in science today happens to be cosmology. And cosmology talks all the time about the origin of the universe, the Big Bang. What came before the Big Bang, if that makes sense to say that it was anything before the Big Bang. And cosmologists talk about quantum fluctuations in a vacuum. They talk about this universe being a 10-dimensional manifold, 6 or 7 dimensions of which are rolled up so small that you don't notice them. Now, is that common sense? I mean, do you even know what I'm talking about? You know, it's not common sense. Is it sense experience? No, it's got nothing to do with sense experience. So is it all rubbish? Well, I don't know. I get the New Scientist every week, and it's full of this stuff. So you could just call it the New Rubbish Journal, perhaps. That would be rather, extreme thing to do and say that scientists are all talking rubbish. There are some people who would say that's true. I mean, that science is putting things in test tubes and shaking them around. In other words, what you can do experiments with, that's what science is. But cosmology, talking about the Big Bang and the origins of the universe, that's not science anymore. But there wouldn't be many scientists who'd say that, really. And people like Steven Weinberg, who actually wrote a book called The First 3 Minutes. And if you ask the first 3 minutes of what, the answer is the first 3 minutes of absolutely everything. And he can tell you in detail what happened in the first 3 minutes. Well, for David Hume, that would be an impossibility. You couldn't do that. So how are people like Weinberg doing it? They're doing it not by looking at sense experiences very hard. That wouldn't get you anywhere in science. What they're doing is constructing theories to explain how things like background cosmic radiation exist now, and how it is that the stars look as though they're accelerating away from us, how it is that the universe looks the size that it does look, why it is that there's a red shift in the stars. Things like that need explaining, and it's explanation which leads you to talk about the origin of the universe as consisting in a rapid inflationary moment from a point of infinite density and mass, the Big Bang. So something that nobody could possibly observe is accepted by almost all scientists as just a fact. The argument about steady-state theory versus the Big Bang is over. I better be careful, because by the time I finish this lecture, it might have started again. But at the moment, the issue seems to be resolved, and certainly it's something that cosmologists can talk about. Now, my point is simply that Hume's philosophy cannot cope with this. It can't say anything about it. It ought to be impossible. So on Humean grounds, anything but the simplest forms of empirical science, that is, you look at something and you look at a liquid and see whether it turns red or green, and that's all you can do. But you can't ever explain string theory or quantum theory. What on earth would David Hume say about quantum theory? That electrons are probability waves in Hilbert space. Can you observe them? Absolutely not. There's no way you can observe them. So what are you talking about? Remember what John Locke said? Knowledge consists in nothing but the detection of the resemblance or disresemblance between ideas. Well, which ideas are not resembling each other when you talk about probability waves in Hilbert space? In other words, modern science is much more Platonic than Humean. You might not like the word Platonic, but at least it's much more committed to the fact that mathematics tells you the truth about the world. And it tells you that the truth about the world is that we cannot possibly picture it. And one of the things that goes wrong with empiricist philosophy is that it thinks all the things that you can know about and all the things that are true are things you can picture in your mind. Whereas what modern science tells you is that that is probably the most false statement you could ever make, because things that you can picture in your mind are almost certainly false. You do, when you picture things in your mind, say you picture the Big Bang. Well, a good example is I went to the radio astronomy laboratory in Cambridge, and you've seen pictures produced by radio astronomy, and they're beautiful pictures of galaxies and stars, and they're very, very nice. And I thought I might see some of these things, and as I went along, I was a bit surprised at first because there was nothing there but a large field with some aerials in it. When it was radio astronomy, I should have realized that, really. But there were just a lot of aerials there. There weren't any telescopes. And then there were some computers. So I said, well, look, where are these pictures? And they said, oh, they're computer generated. And I said, well, look, do they look like that, all these wonderful galaxies? And they said, of course not. They don't look like that. That's just to help you to see what they might be like. What we actually get are radio waves. It's not visible light that we're looking at here at all. And so that was a lesson straight away that radio astronomy does not tell you what stars look like. What it does is produce computer-generated images which would tell you what the stars would look like if you were able to look at them, which you're not. I mean, there are some visual telescopes as well, but the point is this, that computer-generated facts are these days as real facts. Well, we all know that. I saw a film on television recently about Attila the Hun. And in this film, there were thousands of warriors, Huns, fighting thousands of Romans. But actually, there was only one person fighting. The rest were all computer-generated. It was amazing, and it had all been generated from this one figure. So, you know, you can generate these simulated things, and that's how a lot of science goes. What we get when we look at the results of science are simulations of what things would look like if they were visible, but they're not. So you probably know that in 2008, which is this year as I speak, there is going to be a crucial experiment at CERN in Geneva, which will probably end the universe. Well, we have to wait and see whether it does. It won't take long, however, if it happens. And the idea is they're going to accelerate particles in such a way that they could conceivably create a black hole, and that could conceivably swallow us all up. But it will be fairly painless. It'll be so quick. So we'll probably never discover if it's true, but we will discover if it's false. So it's falsifiable. Another suggestion about that experiment is that it may result in time travelers coming from the future and taking advantage of some wormhole that they've established. Well, you know, what am I talking about? Who knows? Am I talking about anything sensible? Well, it's in the New Scientist this week. My point again is Hume cannot deal with all this. He's got no way of dealing with it because he's limited to a world of sense perceptions. Sense perceptions, they're not even commonsensical, because common sense believes in an external world of objects. The strange thing is the external world of objects that common sense believes in is not the world of objects that science lives in. It's a different world. The common sense world is one like these simulated pictures of faraway galaxies. That is, it's what you imagine you would see if you could look at them. But actually, you can't look at them. There's no way you can look at quarks or at photons. You use photons to look at things, but you can't really look at them, or you can't see what they're like, but you can draw pictures of them. So we have to get away from the idea of picturing, of imaging, of sense experience, and we have to talk about mathematical equations. Paul Dirac, great quantum physicist in Cambridge, said, the reason I chose the equations of quantum theory that I did choose is because they are the most beautiful and elegant that I could think of. Not because he saw them. You know, mathematical equations can't be seen. And if you ask the question, what do mathematical equations in quantum physics represent? The truth is, nobody knows. They work. Now, you may say that's pragmatism again. You know, we just accept them because they work. But that's not quite true. You don't accept a mathematical theory in quantum physics just because it works. You really do think it's true, but I don't know what it represents. That is to say, I can't picture it. My understanding has gone a long way beyond my sense experience. So the whole of modern science is a feat, a brilliant feat of intellectual understanding, which has begun from some sense experiences, but which has gone a long way beyond sense experience, and which in the end replaces sense experiences almost entirely by saying the nature of reality is very different from anything that we actually experience. So Hume must be radically wrong in thinking that all knowledge is confined to experience, because modern science shows that actually almost no knowledge in science is confined to experience. Certainly that would be true of cosmology and quantum physics, right? So you've got to realize the way in which science has outdated empiricism completely. And that's a nice little ironic story, because the logical positivists who tried to follow Hume thought that they were supporting science. They thought that all these metaphysical high-flown facts that people like Plato talked about could be abolished by simply positive attention to experiences. And that was the bedrock of science. But they were totally wrong. That is not the bedrock of science. The bedrock of science is the equations, Schrödinger equations, which tells you what happens in the causal sequences of subatomic phenomena. And they deal in things that we can't imagine, that we can't picture, that few of us can understand, but they are understandable. So understanding has a place. When Hume says our conclusions about reality are not founded on any process of understanding, he's as wrong as anybody could ever possibly be. Almost all our conclusions about reality are founded precisely on processes of understanding. What modern science insists upon, of course, that understanding must be checked by observation, but not that it should be limited to observation. Let me give you a quotation, which I found quite useful in this context, from Stephen Hawking, from a page in A Brief History of Time, which I don't think anybody ever got up to, but I picked it out at random, I should say. And here it is, from Hawking. The idea that space and time should be finite without boundary is just a proposal. It may initially be put forward for aesthetic or metaphysical reasons, but the real test is whether it makes predictions that agree with observations. This, however, is difficult to determine. Just notice that last phrase. He makes the gesture that all good scientists must make. There have to be, in the end, predictions, observations. There has to be some sort of empirical testing. But actually, in modern science, that is very difficult to determine how you would do it. Nobody, to my knowledge, has yet thought how you could possibly test string theory by observation. There is no way that anybody's thought of doing it. That doesn't mean string theory doesn't exist. People still get paid for inventing it. So science has moved a long way beyond just observing, recording, and then sticking to what you've seen. It's theory-laden to such an extent that the theory drives the observations. Not only that, the theory is so sophisticated that if most of us had the observations that would confirm it, we wouldn't know whether it had been confirmed or not. We wouldn't have the slightest idea. You go to CERN in Geneva and you get a sort of photographic plate, and on it there are lots of little lines and blurs and splotches and things, and somebody says to you, oh, well, that confirms the theory about, you know, the Z0 particle. Well, would it? You know, you look at it and you say, oh, yes, so it does. You wouldn't have the slightest idea. So you don't even know in modern science how to interpret the observations without a huge amount of theory. That's the point, right? So the theory, in a sense, comes before the observation, right? You've got to have observation, but the relation between the observation and the theory is very indirect. It has to be there. And I suggest to you that believing in God is very like that. That is to say, if I put God into Stephen Hawking's quotation, the idea that there should be a God who creates the universe for a purpose is just a proposal. It may initially be put forward for aesthetic or metaphysical reasons, but the real test is whether it makes predictions that agree with observation. That's true. Sooner or later, somebody will have to have some observations that show that there is a God. If there is a God. That's true. But this, however, is very difficult to determine, because in order to do that, you would have to be dead. It's presumably only after you're dead that you see whether there's a God or not, if there is a God. Right? If there isn't a God, you won't see anything, so it wouldn't matter. But that is exactly the sort of thing that modern physics says. You know, it's quite difficult to determine. You've got a theory, you accept the theory because it's elegant, because it's comprehensive, because it's fruitful, all sorts of reasons. It unites different sorts of knowledge into one pleasing aesthetic whole, perhaps. And in the end, you say, well, there must be some observational tests. But they're very difficult to determine. It's not always straightforward. So in the case of God, you have factors which favor God. That is, people do claim to experience God. They claim to have experiences of transcendent reality and power. About 50% of most populations claim that. But on the other hand, you have the problem of suffering and evil and all sorts of difficulties that people have with belief in that way. So it's difficult to determine. And we haven't got a conclusive test. But it's just like string theory, right? The difference, of course, between string theory and belief in God is that belief in God is not chosen because it's a good theory. String theory is. I mean, belief in God is chosen because of a response to what is believed to be divine self-disclosure. For Christians, that comes in the person of Jesus Christ, but for other religions, it would come in other ways, like revelation in the Quran or in the Hebrew Bible, for example. But somewhere, people come to think God has spoken to them, God has called them, God has almost compelled them to respond with an affirmation of trust. So that's what religion is founded on. There's nothing like that in string theory. Well, there shouldn't be anyway, although some scientists do claim to have had things revealed to them in their dreams, but so there's even some similarity there. But of course, religion is not primarily a theoretical matter. It's primarily a practical matter of commitment and the way you live, the way you see things. Science is theoretical. So the only point I'm making, I'm not making them identical. The point I am making is that intellectual understanding is much more important in modern science than sense experience. And Hume's philosophy simply cannot account for that at all. So when Hume says, with what assurance can we decide concerning the origin of worlds, Stephen Hawking would say, with a very great deal of assurance, as a matter of fact. And we have to take that into account if we're looking for a reasonable philosophy. So that's the first point from the dialogues. As I say, I got 5. The second one is about evil. Now, this is obvious. I mean, everybody's thought of the problem of evil, if God is supposed to be good. So Hume raises that problem in the dialogues, and I can't completely ignore it, though I don't want to say too much about it at this point. What I'll say is this, and again, I'll appeal to science. I'll appeal to a great atheist, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Steven Weinberg, who says in his book, Dreams of a Final Theory, that perhaps there is a final theory of the universe, and by that he means a theory which would show that this is the only universe, and these are the only laws, and these are the only fundamental constants that would be compatible mathematically with the existence of carbon-based intelligent life forms. Okay, and make that point again, that there are serious physicists, Steven Weinberg among them, who is an atheist, so has no axe to grind, who would hold that if there are going to be intelligent life forms, anything at all like us in this universe, then the fundamental laws of nature, like the law of gravity, they have to be what they are. And of course, then you see that if the law of gravity exists, it's going to have unfortunate effects on people who jump off cliffs. So if the law of gravity exists, there is going to be suffering in the universe. It's going to happen. And it's always going to be possible, whether it happens or not. So in a way, science can give you, again, an intellectual, it perhaps is not very satisfying emotionally, give you an intellectual response to why evil exists, why suffering exists. And the answer would lie in showing the necessity of the laws of nature to having things like us existing. It's a bit like saying, well, if you love mountain climbing, as I do, you will accept that a lot of the fun of mountain climbing is that you might fall off. Now, falling off is not fun, don't get me wrong, but the fun of it is knowing that you could fall off, and you're very clever because you don't. And you will accept that, of course, other people do, and that you might. Extreme sports are even worse. I mean, really extreme sports. People do it because it's dangerous. Now, don't ask me about psychology. All I'm saying is it's not the case that a universe without any possibility of suffering and death and failure in it would be obviously better than this one. Right? There may be deep necessities in the world which make the world the way it is. I'm not solving the problem of evil. I'm saying, again, if you look for an intellectual understanding of that matter, then perhaps science can actually help by showing the necessity of some of the fundamental laws of nature, and things like the fact that carbon atoms are only formed in the explosions of stars. So you only get life if stars explode. But if you're anywhere near a star, when it explodes, it's going to hurt, again, for a very short time. So then, that's into the universe, there is destruction as well as creation. Not a complete answer, but I think what it shows is it's not just an easy thing to say, oh, well, there's suffering in the universe, therefore a good God couldn't have created it. You can say that that's not quite so obvious. We would need to understand a lot more about what's necessary to having a universe like this before we could make that argument. And these things are indeed difficult to determine. So that's the second point. The third point is one that interests me mostly, but it bores everybody else completely, so I'll not spend too much time on it. It's the problem of necessity. This has fascinated me all my life, but people go to sleep as soon as I start talking about it. So I'll try and I'll watch out for the symptoms. Hume says this, it's become a very famous statement, whatever we conceive as existent, we can also conceive as non-existent. So if somebody comes along and says, well, at the basis of the universe there is God, and God exists by necessity, that is, God could not fail to exist. God is something to which there is no alternative. God has to be the way God is. I agree with all those statements, incidentally. And Hume is saying, well, look, I can imagine God, and I can imagine God not existing. And if I can imagine it, it could happen. Therefore, God can't be necessary. Okay? So the crucial move here is to say, whatever I can imagine can happen. A similar sort of argument is again about evil. I can imagine a universe without any evil in it, therefore God could have created one. Okay? So because I can imagine it, it could happen. So no necessary beings, and there doesn't have to be any evil. And again, this goes back to the roots of Hume's philosophy. Is what you can imagine going to be the test of what is real? And I want to make a big distinction, as in fact I've already done implicitly, between imagination, which is a form of picturing or a form of sense experience, and understanding. So these things are quite different. What you think you can imagine might be totally different from what is intellectually the case, which you could intellectually understand. And I think a fairly good example of this is the question which is dealt with by Robin Wilson in Gresham Lectures quite recently. Can you find a square which is equal in size to a given circle? Now, I wonder how you decide that. Do you do it just by imagining? Okay, I'm not going to answer the question, can you find a square equal in area, exactly equal in area to a given circle? I'm just going to ask you, how would you go about deciding this? Well, Hume's method would be, well, you think of a circle, you imagine it, and then you imagine a square, and you imagine them having the same size. No problem. Yes. The answer is yes, because you can imagine it. So, and my point is, your imagination is a complete waste of time. I don't care what you think you can imagine. You have to know something about pi. You have to know something about how you find the area of a circle, and you have to know how you could translate that into the size of a square or a rectangle before you can intellectually answer the question. And, well, it might look as though it wouldn't be so easy, would it, really, to know that, because pi is an irrational number. It doesn't look as though it has any end. So, intellectual understanding might give you a different answer from imagination. And that's the only point I want to make, which will save everybody going to sleep rather quickly. That is, you think you can imagine things, but perhaps unless you understood fully what was involved, you might be quite wrong in thinking you could imagine it. One other example I'll give you, again, I won't give you the answer to it, I don't in fact know the answer to this one. Is time travel possible? Could you travel back in time? Well, use your imagination, and the answer seems to be obviously yes, because I've seen it in the cinema. So I've seen it, I can imagine it, I've seen it, so it's obviously possible. But could you really answer the question like that? Wouldn't you have to know a lot about the nature of time? Wouldn't you have to use your intellectual understanding? It's not just a matter of the old case of you go back and you murder your grandfather so you couldn't have existed, which is probably difficult. So people have to think of ways in which you never meet your grandfather in order to make time travel possible. But it's not just a question of that, it's a question of what would be involved in backwards causation, in going backwards in time. And that's such a difficult problem that I don't believe anybody has resolved it. So we might come to an answer, but you have to say, well, what's at stake here is not imagination, it's not picturing. In fact, let me be very dogmatic and say that probably if you're talking about the ultimate nature of space and time and the ultimate nature of the universe, anything you can picture is bound to be wrong. Right? That the universe is completely unpicturable. It is unimaginable. It's not only God who's unimaginable, but God is even more unimaginable than the universe. But even the universe is unimaginable. So if you say that, imagination is not a guide to the things that can exist. So Hume is wrong, then, in saying that whatever we can conceive, he means imagine, whatever we can imagine as existent, we can also conceive as non-existent. Let me just end this section by saying, if you think that God necessarily exists, what you're saying is, in every conceivable world, there is a God. There is no conceivable world without God. I don't mean imaginable now, that's Hume's interpretation. I mean intellectually, fully understandable. And that is not a self-contradictory statement. Just to say, it's certainly a possibility. It is possible that in every conceivable universe there is a God. That is, there is no universe without God if you understood it, if you understood what was involved in there being a universe. I think you have to say, well, that's a very difficult question, and it's not a matter of just what I think I can imagine. So that argument of Hume's that because we can imagine certain things they're possible seems a very bad one. And indeed, if I may put the knife in rather deeply, it contradicts his own principle, his principle that whatever we conceive as non-existent might not exist. That contradicts his principle that, and I quote, the ultimate springs and principles of nature are totally shut up from human curiosity. I.e., we don't know whether anything is necessary in nature at all. And to make it worse, Hume actually thought the laws of nature were actually necessary. And you remember he wrote a very bad chapter on miracles, one of the worst ever written in the history of philosophy, in which he said there couldn't be any miracles because the laws of nature necessarily operate. I ask you, how contradictory can you possibly get? So I want to reject completely Hume's principle that if you think you can imagine something, it could exist. That's the third point. The fourth one, still used by some people today, in fact, Richard Dawkins uses it in his book, the name of which I've forgotten. And in Hume's version, it is this. Any God who created a complex universe like this would have to be at least as complex as the universe, and therefore would need explanation in the same way. And again, this is absolutely false, right? And the falsity can be demonstrated quite easily. The universe is complex. The universe is complex because it's made up of simpler parts, like atoms or quarks, which build up into complicated wholes. So the universe is made up of parts of things which could exist on their own, but they actually form together to form complex wholes. But God, by definition, is not made up of separate parts which are built up together to form one being. So God is not complex in the same way that the universe is. There is a sense in which God is complex. God contains the ideas of every possible universe there could ever be. God has knowledge of everything that exists. That's a certain sort of complexity. But nevertheless, God, as conceived by most philosophers, is a being with one consciousness, indivisible, and containing all possible information. So God is not composed of separate parts. And that's the traditional sense of saying God is simple. He's not composed of separate parts. So it's obviously false that God needs explaining in the same way that the universe does. What needs explaining about the universe is how you can get very complicated things like us coming out of simple atoms bumping into one another. That needs explaining, right? And there are ways of explaining that scientifically. But God doesn't need explaining like that. How could you explain God? Well, traditionally, the explanation for the existence of God is that God is a sort of being that is not causable, that could not be brought into being, that is, in other words, timeless. Now, again, this is a matter of intellectual understanding. It's not a matter of imagining. Intellectually, it is perfectly coherent to form the notion of something which is not in time. It's not temporal. In fact, all of mathematics is like that. It's not temporal. And if there is a timeless being, then it cannot logically be brought into being by anything. So it could not be explained by showing what brought it into being. Now, if you ask the question, what or who caused God, you haven't understood the idea of God, because the idea of God is of something timeless. If you can't frame that idea, think again, because it's perfectly easy to frame it. Right? A being, you just think of a temporal being, and then you think of a being which is not temporal. You just put the not in front. You know, it's quite easy. So you can all conceive, though none of you can imagine, a non-temporal, timeless God. And then you are logically compelled to say nothing could possibly cause that God to be. No? It either is or it isn't. And if it is, it necessarily is. If it's not, it's necessarily not. But actually, there are lots of things around, so it probably necessarily is. Okay? Because if there wasn't a God, well, you go through other arguments, which I won't go into, that there wouldn't be anything else either. But again, it's just false to suggest that God, a necessary being by definition, one consciousness containing all possible knowledge and bringing about the universe for one fairly simple reason, namely for the sake of its goodness, it's quite false to suggest that being would need explaining because it's made of a lot of separate parts, and you have to account for how the parts got together in this rather complicated way. That's just a parody of the idea of God. And, of course, Hume means it to be. That was the fourth point, I think. So the last one, I'm just going to get it done in time, is that Hume talks about the uselessness of the idea of God. He says, well, all you do, if you talk about reasons for the existence of God, is either you come up with what he calls some remote analogy to human intelligence, so remote that you can't derive any conclusions from it at all, or you indulge in vulgar superstition leading to hypocrisy and intolerance. Those are the only alternatives he gives. And then just to say then, well, look, the idea of God, as most philosophers have thought of it, has a practical import which is the opposite of hypocrisy and intolerance, though you could never prevent those things occurring. But if the idea of God is the idea of one being of necessary existence and supreme value, that will include supreme compassion, supreme love, supreme justice, supreme all the good things you can think of, beauty, well, the postulate of such a being will actually lead to a very radical change of life, because you will think that the whole of your existence is brought into being by that being of supreme value, and that it is therefore of supreme importance to discover how you yourself could participate in such a being, or share or know about the value that is in it and that is surely imaged in the world that it creates. In other words, the postulate of God has practical implications. It enables you to see the world in the light of eternity. It enables you to see the shadows of this world in the light of that sun, which is perfect goodness and beauty. And that isn't a matter either of remote analogy or vulgar superstition. So I think I would accuse David Hume of actually intentionally misunderstanding religion by looking at the bad habits of some of its less exalted devotees, instead of by looking at the philosophical idea of God, which was that held by his colleague Thomas Reid. I may have seemed rather blunt with Hume. I do think his philosophy is wrong from start to finish. But let me say that, of course, I do consider him to be a very polished writer of English, or perhaps Scottish prose, and that I do consider it to be a good thing that he's on the syllabus of most philosophy classes, because philosophy classes exist in order to criticize what they read. He's a very good representative of the Scottish Enlightenment, though unusual in not believing in God, but he's someone who shows also that when you think of the Enlightenment in Europe, you mustn't think of the reign of reason. You must think of the complete undermining of reason to make it nothing more than the slave of passion. And in the end, I think it's belief in God, belief that there is one reason underlying the structure of this universe, that the structure is rational, and that it can be understood by reasoning and intellectual understanding. It is faith in such a God which preserves belief in reason. And it is the rejection of such a God which leads to the rule of unreason and passion. And in that sense, the Enlightenment is perhaps the opposite of what some of us have been told that it is. Not the rule of reason, but the demolition of reason.